Hi everyone, I'm going to talk to you about informational text and the Common Core State Standards. When you look at the Common Core State Standards, you can see two main text types, literary and informational. As students move through the grade levels, the amount of informational text in the curriculum increases. When looking at these percentages, it's important to note that they are for the student across the content areas. So a math teacher is not expected to have their math class include 50% literary and 50% informational text. Instead, this percentage is across all subject areas. So when a student goes to math and English and science and social studies and elective classes, that is the percentage of text of each type that they should experience. Why is there an increased emphasis on informational text in the Common Core standards? Well, there's several reasons. One main reason is that increasing informational text, especially in the younger grades, will provide greater continuity across the grade levels. So one concern is the fourth grade slump, in which students move from learning to read to reading to learn. And when students begin reading to learn, they experience a greater amount of informational text. So it's important that they have exposure and experience with these texts in the younger grades to make this transition easier. Another reason is that the use of informational text can better prepare students for their future. When students go to college or they enter their career, they experience mostly informational text. Also, when students become adults and grown-ups in the world, it's known that they read mostly informational text. So it's important for their futures that they are very knowledgeable about this text type. Also, informational text can build greater content knowledge, and it can appeal to certain students, so it can increase their motivation. When you look at the types of text, you can see there's two main types, the narrative and the informational. You can see that narrative is comprised of stories, dramas, and poetry. And then there's kind of this big hunk of informational text. So informational texts are very diverse, and this category encompasses many different types of text. So you can see that it includes technical science texts that are going to have more diagrams and charts and things like that. And it's also comprised of biographies and autobiographies. So these are books that have more of a narrative structure. I like to think of informational text in four main categories. It kind of helps me to distinguish between them. You can see the first type is expository. So this is kind of what's been traditionally referred to as informational text. They're going to have your table of contents, a glossary, an index. They're going to have headings, bolded or italicized keywords. And the purpose of these texts is to inform or explain something to the reader. Another type is the literary nonfiction. So these are going to be your biographies or autobiographies. They provide facts, but they follow a narrative structure. Another type is going to be argument or persuasion texts. These texts are trying to convince the reader to take a stance on an issue. So they're going to have an argument and then give information that's going to convince the reader to take the author's position. And another type is procedural. So these give step-by-step guides for making or doing something. So these would be more like recipes or how to make a paper airplane, those types of things. When you look at these texts, they all have different features, different purposes, and they're very different, even though they're all informational texts. For example, expository texts are going to have features like the table of contents, whereas procedural texts are going to have materials and steps, step 1, step 2, step 3. Also, reading these texts can be vastly different. If I read an expository text, I can look at the table of contents, and if I'm only interested in what elephants eat, I can go straight to page 6 and find that information. Whereas if I'm reading a procedural text, if I start on page 6, I am not going to make what I needed to make in that text. I'm going to be very, very lost. So each one of these types of informational texts have very different purposes and structures within them. So there are some problems with this broad definition of informational text. So one is ignoring the wide range. it's very easy to think, oh, we have informational text, they're all this one category, they're all the same, but they're not. So as teachers, we need to understand that informational text is a very broad and large category and that we need to see differentiation within that. So as teachers, we need to focus on how are these texts different for our readers so that they can comprehend them better. Also, we need to, as teachers, acknowledge that there's this diversity and we need to spend time with each text type. So I think about when I was a teacher and I used a lot of expository text. I did teach persuasion text, but I really just talked about the author's purpose to persuade, and we wrote essays to persuade a reader, but I really didn't read a lot of this type of informational text. So as a teacher, it's important to reflect and think, am I really showing students the diversity within this type of text? So when you think about different books, like there's some examples here of titles. So we might have a book called All About Elephants. This is one that we think is a classic expository text, so you might expect to see table of contents, index, headings, bold words, and we know that we're going to be informed about elephants. The second title, Save the African Elephants, that one's most likely a persuasive text. So the author's most likely going to give arguments for why we need to work towards saving these elephants. And then the last text, How to Care for an Elephant at the Zoo, is most likely a procedural text. It's going to give us a step-by-step guide for how to do that. So when we think about these texts, they have very different purposes, which is reflected in the structure of the text, and we need to teach students how to approach different texts. So some important things to notice is that there's no such thing as informational text features or nonfiction text features. Because this genre is so broad, there is not one type for these texts. There's great diversity within it. So there are many types of text with different purposes, features, processes, and as teachers, we have to vary our instructional strategies to help students deal with these differences. Also, students are going to need experience with each text type. So if we teach students about expository text, that doesn't mean that they're going to understand procedural text and be able to read them, comprehend them, and write that genre. So it's very important that we acknowledge this diversity within informational text and we teach students about that so that they can be successful with these texts. So there's lots of different structures that informational text can have. So you can see here sequence, cause and effect, these types. And the tricky thing about them is informational text can vary in their structure even within the same text. So for example, if I'm reading about lions, they might have a compare and contrast section where they compare lions to tigers. And they also might have kind of a cyclical section where they talk about the life cycle of lions. So it's important that we understand that informational text structures vary even within the same text, which can make them hard because, as we know, narrative structures have a very consistent text structure that they follow. So here's some more in-depth about informational text structures. And a lot of times you can teach kids to look for signal words that are going to help them. So this chart is really great. I used this as a reference when I was teaching. So just some things to remember about informational texts. They are diverse. They're very, very different. So thinking about informational text broadly, we need to kind of break it down for students and teach them that there's great diversity within this. And because of this diversity, we need to use different types of instruction for different texts. And students should have hands-on experience. That's the best way for them to learn about these texts. And I think if you're doing texts like that are procedural, it's important for students to be able to follow that procedure and get that real hands-on experience. Also, informational texts are flexible, so they do employ different text structures within the same text. Hopefully this PowerPoint helped you to think about informational text and understand more about their features.